I'm David Kramer, the director of the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Let me begin by saying a few technical details about how we will conduct today's event, this evening's event, I should say, and then introduce the event itself. I ask you to keep yourselves on mute over the course of the author's presentation, and actually through the event as a whole. With the number of people who join us, it's very difficult to be able to ask questions live and in a way that is verbally heard. So what I invite you to do is to take any questions you may have during the presentation at any time or following, and throw them into chat. I will keep a record of what is in chat, and I will share the questions with the author when that time comes. You also can see, I hope on your screen now, that I've highlighted myself and the author. This is so that you can see us and have a better sense of who we are. And I will unhighlight myself actually, or unspotlight myself, to use Zoom's language, when the author begins her presentation. I want to again welcome all of you on behalf of the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. It is our privilege and pleasure to be able to offer this series of book talks over the course of the year, and we've really attracted some wonderful authors speaking about wonderful books, and tonight's event certainly fits those qualifications. A wonderful book by a wonderful author, and one that you will hear a lot about and hopefully be motivated to go out and buy. I can speak for myself and with great enthusiasm when I say that I took the time over the course of the Passover holiday to read the book between the beginning and end of Pesach, and found myself moved and engaged, drawn into a very, very compelling and disturbing story. I'll say a word about that again in just a moment. But let me step outside and remark on the fact that this is the week of Yom HaShoah. Thursday actually is Holocaust Commemoration Day on the Jewish calendar. And this book is appropriately chosen to be one of two events. I'll say more about the second event after tonight's program, but this is one of two events that the library is sponsoring in commemoration of Yom HaShoah. The book, All the Horrors of War by Bernice Lerner, is on the one hand, a Holocaust history memoir that joins many, many others, but it stands apart in a variety of significant respects. First of all, we can't take it for granted that these accounts will be written in ways that will draw us in as readers, that they will be, in other words, fine pieces of literary composition. And this book is certainly that. Beyond that, though, it takes a very unique perspective. First of all, the author is the daughter of the person we might call the main character of the book, the woman who is able to survive through the most difficult challenges of the war. And this story told by the author, I should say, I'm sorry, by her daughter as narrator, has a special quality. It's a quality that one often doesn't find in volumes of this sort. The other perspective, which is very important and rarely found in these accounts, is the perspective of those who saved, those who came in as the events were, thank God, drawing to a close and had a part in the liberation. But what we often don't hear is the experience of the liberators, the trauma of the liberators, what they discovered, and how just earth-shaking everything that they saw was for them. This book ties together both of those threads. The story of the survivor, the girl who went through these events, and the story of someone who participated in the liberation. I will allow Bernice Lerner to say more about that. I just want to again emphasize how pleased we are to be able to offer this talk during the week of Yom HaShoah. And Bernice, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to all of you. I know you have many things you could be doing this evening that could compete with this time. So I'm really grateful that you signed on to this talk. And what you're going to hear about is probably one of the most dramatic moments in not just Jewish history, but in human history. It's probably the largest liberation in the history of humankind. So I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to show you some slides. So my book is called All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen. I have on the left the US publication of the book, and on the right is the UK publication. It came out at the same time last year in April, in time for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And both publishers were furnished with the same images and the same text, but they came out with completely different covers and titles, as you'll see. So I'm just going to point out to you in the UK version, this is a picture of Rachel Genuth, who is one of the protagonists in my book, one of two protagonists. She is here 15 years old, and you can see that she is already has some nourishment, but she's not one of these pictures of a happy, cheerful young adult survivor that you might see, someone in their 20s who may be looking to rebuild their life. She is orphaned and she is very sick with tuberculosis. And here she is in a sanatorium in snowy Northwest Sweden in Arvika. And she is my mom. And the book was written in response to my question of how my mom survived. She had told me stories of the trauma of the war all my life, but she had fallen unconscious at the end and was really very close to death and could not tell me how she was saved. So in exploring her rescue, I came across the man most prominently associated with the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and you see him up here. He is Glyn Hughes, Hugh Llewelyn Glyn Hughes. He is, at the time of the liberation, Deputy Director of Medical Services for the British Second Army. And here's a picture of him in his caravan near the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Could be working on anything having to do with the rescue, having to do with 5 different types of diets to feed the starved. I found all kinds of materials in the archives. So how was I going to tell this dual biography about these really disparate characters who came from different social milieus, different, very vastly different positions, and who honestly never met? It could have been a more dramatic story had he come across her and adopted her at the end of the war, but that didn't happen, and this is a work of nonfiction. So I had the challenge of telling the story of the last year of the war. That's what I focused the book on, the last year of the war, from these 2 different points of views. So I sandwiched between the 4 seasons, and the last year of the war was the prologue and the epilogue, which gave me an opportunity to really think deeply about why I wanted to write this book. And really, I appreciate what prologues and epilogues can do for authors, because they can put in some of the most important stories. So in the prologue, I tell of my mother's events that happened in my mother's life when she was 11 years old, which had to do with the very first massacre of the Holocaust in the Ukraine, and her family. And in the epilogue, I'm able to tell about the important chapter of her recovery in Sweden, and also about Glyn Hughes and the kind of man he was and how he assimilated the experience of having liberated Bergen-Belsen into the rest of his life. And then I have just a couple of pages in the beginning and the end about the Belsen trial, sort of setting the scene for what the reader will find out about, and then some more of the very dramatic details of the Belsen trial. And this is an Army Talks paper from November 11th, 1945. While the trial is still going on, it was in a makeshift courtroom in Lüneburg. And here on the bottom are some of the 45 SS men and women who were on trial. This is Irma Gracie, who became the most famous because she was called the beautiful blonde beast, very sadistic woman, and was hung at the age of 22. But what I wanted just to share is that this was the first war crime to apply international law to these war criminals, very different than the Nuremberg laws, Nuremberg trial immediately preceding that trial. And Glyn Hughes was the first witness. So he was the first witness, I say, at the first international war crimes trial, setting the tone of the trials. So I tell the story over 1 year's time of really the greater context of what was happening in the war, what was happening as the Nazis were racing to kill as many Jews as they could, having already lost in Stalingrad and known that they would be defeated, and what was going on with Glyn Hughes and the British and other allies as they were preparing for the D-Day invasion. And I traced their paths season by season, my mom and Glyn Hughes. And I just want to give you one little fact, which is that in Auschwitz on June 6th, 1944, the D-Day, the day that the most magnificent armada in the annals of military history arrived on the shores of Normandy. On that day, in those battles, those first D-Day battles, more people were killed, more than twice as many people were killed in Auschwitz than all of the allies who were killed in this battle. So that is something to ponder. And every day after June 6th through at least the middle of July, the same staggering figure death toll took place at Auschwitz, whereas the numbers decreased for the allies fighting up through France and then Belgium and into Germany. So I had the privilege of really diving deep into Glyn Hughes's archives in England. And I was very taken with his handwriting. I became very used to deciphering it. And as an amateur graphologist, I saw certain things in it that sort of validated what I thought about him and the things he was actually, the content of what he was writing. But this just gives you a sense of the details of the planning. Here, this chart on the left is D-Day, how many casualties there were and how they were evacuated, and D+1, D+2, that means 2 days after D-Day, D+3, 3 days after, and all the calculations, the general hospitals he had to commandeer, the special units. It just gives you a little bit of a taste of the planning. And I would say that his character was such that he really emphasized overseeing all the medical corps, the casualty clearing stations, the field ambulances. He always emphasized planning, practice, planning, anticipation, looking for where he could commandeer things and resources, but being flexible, but always being very planful and having everyone go through all the steps. Now, you have to realize this when you think about him then coming into Bergen-Belsen, which was a total shock and something for which none of the allies had planned. And that happened on April 15th, 1945. So this was the point of convergence of my mom's story and Glyn Hughes's story and the story of so many thousands of others. they came, my mom had already been in Bergen-Belsen for about a month. She was in very, very bad shape. The norm in March of 1945 and first couple of weeks in April was death. Anne Frank, a few months older than my mom, had died a couple of weeks before my mom's arrival in the camp. Um, it was it was a really unimaginable situation. The last week before before the British Second Army arrived, there was no food rations, no water, nothing given to the inmates at all. And you had a situation where there were 60,000 starved and emaciated people in the camp. In Camp One, there were two camps. Camp One is pictured down below, and it was called the Horror Camp. And there were the most of the inmates were there. There was about 41,000 inmates here. And here you see this sort of road bisecting the camp. There were three huge compounds on one side, two on the other, men and women separate, mostly more women than men. And on April 12th, and the truth is stranger than fiction story, Heinrich Himmler decided to turn the Bergen-Belsen camp over to the Allies, to the approaching Allies. And this is just 3 weeks before the end of the war. And to clean up the camp, and by clean up, I mean piles and piles of corpses lying everywhere, they decided to organize, the SS decided to organize a parade. And the parade involved having those inmates who could still walk, they were just barely ambulatory, drag the ones who had died to a vast open pit at the end of the road. And I was maybe 14 or 15 years old when I was in the basement of my mom's house, of our home growing up, watching my mom iron clothes. And we're talking about the war, and the word Holocaust even hadn't even come into modern parlance. She was just telling me about what happened to her during the war. When she decided that she, I guess, maybe not consciously, but she decided I was old enough to hear about some of the horrors. And she put down the iron and she demonstrated for me how she, who was, she said she was 50% dead, had to hold, she bent forward, stretched her arms out behind her, and showed how she would have to hold corpses and some people who were still breathing, who still had life in them, on to the end of the down this road. Now, the cleanup plan failed because people kept dying as they were doing the work, so it had to be abandoned. And when the British came in, they found a devastating situation, dead people everywhere. And I really tremble in showing you these images because I don't have the permissions of these people to show their images, and these are human beings. But I want to drive home the point of what happened. So here you see the horror camp, Camp One, where my mom was, 41,000 people there still breathing at the time the British came in. And you see that there were about 80 SS left, 80 SS and guards left in the camp to facilitate the turnover. And here you see some SS guards who are pressed into service, having to help with the cleanup of the camp. And you see surviving inmates who are strong enough standing around. Actually, a lot of them were jeering at the SS. And on the bottom left, you see Rabbi Leslie Hardman, who was a British military chaplain who came in right with the Second Army on like the first day of the liberation, who was, honestly, he was near a nervous breakdown. He was ministering to the survivors around the clock. And he was deeply, deeply disturbed about how people were being buried in these huge dugout pits, about 12 feet deep, 20 to 30 feet across, 40 to 50 feet long. And it was, and I talk in the book about his interactions with Glyn Hughes and why Glyn Hughes had to make the decision to bury people this way. On the upper right-hand corner, here's an image of a girl. Could have been my mother, I don't think so. But you see that she has a square cut out of the back of her coat. And I just wanted to point out that this is what happened in the labor camps. where a lot of these people had come from, directly from labor camps. They were either on a death march or some kind of cattle train before they were dumped in Bergen-Belsen. And here's this woman with a square cutout in the back of her coat. Lest she try to escape, she should be easily identifiable. And so that's what they did. And here is on the bottom another image of the sort of squalor and that the British came across. And I can tell you that you can look at some of these images and you can ask, what is it that the photographer wanted us to see? What did the photographer want to show? These are trained military photographers, and they were, some of them after the war, they swore, after Bergen-Belsen, they swore they would never again take pictures. They were so traumatized by having to do this work. On the one hand, realizing the importance of capturing what happened for the historical record. On the other, just going to bed at night with their head splitting open. It was a very macabre scene. Here is a couple of other images, and here on the bottom of the camp, and the bottom right, you can see that there were some who weren't in as bad shape. Death, they were inured to death, so there could have been dead people everywhere. But this scene sort of reminded me of another anecdote my mom told about scavenging for potatoes and trying to cook them, sitting in, with her sister, trying to cook them. And that was another whole aspect of the liberation. It's not that our image of what you would think a liberation would be, with people running and cheering and the sun comes out and it's a nice sunny blue skies and everything is just great. It was a very long process, the liberation. And yeah, there were some who were strong enough to greet their liberators, but most were in very bad shape. And for the first 2 or 3 days after the British came in, April 16th and April 17th, they had to leave Hungarian guards in charge of the camp. They just didn't, they weren't prepared. They didn't have the manpower. They were fighting battles in Northwest Germany. They just came upon this concentration camp that Himmler decided to turn over, which again is a very strange story having to do with being convinced by his masseuse. So it's just extraordinary. They came upon this camp and they didn't have the resources, so they had to let the Hungarian guards stay. The Hungarian guards were shooting even after the liberation at inmates who were running to scavenge for potatoes, where the inmates knew there were mounds of potatoes. So this image probably doesn't look like much. It's gray, it's kind of blurry, but when the British 11th Light Field Ambulance came in on the 3rd day after the liberation, one of the things they did was to pitch a dump of tentage to move out of the very overcrowded huts. These the British called huts, which were really the floor was just a mass of human excreta. They had to try to get less crowding in there to see if they could get, I don't know, a sip of water to someone who might still be breathing. They could just maneuver inside the hut. So they moved those who could still walk out into these tents. Well, this is very significant for me because my mom was in one of these tents, and her fellow inmates, she was too sick one day when it was her turn to close the flap door of the tent, and they told her she had to go back to the hut, and she had to crawl from one of these huts, from one of the tents back to the hut. And when she arrived back in the hut, she was severely beaten up by her fellow inmates and fell unconscious. So how did the British go about the rescue? They had to do some sort of triage. They had to try to save as many people as they could, as quickly as they could. It was a race against time, lost for too many thousands. But one of the things they did was they went into the huts and they marked people who were, they thought, a medic went into each hut, and whoever he thought had a chance of life, he marked with a piece of chalk on their forehead, he marked an X. And there's a lot of sort of micro stories on the ground of what happened. Like my aunt, I just listened to her a tape of her. Several of my aunts survived Bergen-Belsen. She said we picked up the chalk and a piece of chalk that fell down, and we marked our own foreheads. And I tell some other stories in my book, but they could have not marked someone who was still breathing, whom they didn't think had a chance of surviving, who might have, given individualized medical attention, been able to survive. And of course, they took people who were, they didn't know how sick people were, and they took some people who were really sick but looked like they could possibly make it. They marked them and took them in these contaminated ambulances. They were full of typhus. The typhus germ was just everywhere in the dust in the camp. And there were at least 3 epidemics raging throughout the camp: typhus, gastroenteritis, and tuberculosis. So you see these men of the light field ambulance who are doing the rescue work are wearing these protective gear. They took them about 1.5 miles away to what they dubbed the human laundry, which was a cavalry stable that they turned into this place where they had 60 tables, and they pressed German nurses into service to wash and spray the inmates with DDT. Now, why German nurses? Which freaked out some of the inmates, simply because they didn't have the personnel, but they were being supervised by British medics. So here are some approximate numbers, and I'll start reading from the bottom. There were, by May 19th, so the liberation was April 15th, but it took the British a week to get organized and start to evacuate people and bring them to a clean hospital area, which miraculously, luckily, they found not too far away. 14,000 patients were in the Glyn Hughes Hospital by May 19th, 1944. It was the largest facility in Europe. And it was called, it was named for Glyn Hughes. Why was he such a standout character? And why I'm proud to be his first biographer is that he was so compassionate that the survivors who worked closely with him decided to name the hospital complex for him. Excuse me. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried. 500 former inmates died each day for a month after the liberation. There were only about 361 British Army soldiers and medical personnel working in the relief of Bergen-Belsen 2 days after the liberation. It was really hard to get enough person power in. There were 750 to 1,000 sick processed each day for over 3 weeks after the liberation at the human laundry. And I calculate, based on some things my mom shared with me, I calculate that she was probably taken on the first or second day to the human laundry, and then sent in a clean ambulance to a hospital room where she struggled to survive, because I can tell you in her particular case, I can almost figure out which sort of hospital barracks she was taken to, because she told me that there were 12 people in her room. And every day for 3 weeks, every morning, they took out 11 dead and brought in 11 nearly dead. So this is how these little things that she could tell me helped me calculate roughly the area she was taken to and when she was taken. And she was the 12th person holding on for life, barely in and out of consciousness. 25,000 were designated as fit, able to walk. These were Belsen survivors who suffered from various stages of emaciation, who were transferred to a formerly Wehrmacht transit and rehabilitation barracks. And this was where these Wehrmacht buildings was where the displaced persons camp was set up after the war. And the number 25,000 fit, well, some of them fell sick. Able to walk was they could walk up 2 steps. So a lot of them were very weak and wound up in the hospital. 55 to 60,000 sick and dying prisoners were found in Bergen-Belsen at the time of its liberation, the largest concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Europe, the greatest dumping ground for those who had already survived so much. These were people who had managed to escape the gas chambers at Auschwitz and other places, and they had survived slave labor, brutal slave labor, and a lot of them had survived death marches. So by the time they got here, these were the strongest of the inmates who were taken and physically, and it was a very large dumping ground. Again, the Nazis were trying to move all the prisoners away from the liberating forces, from the Russians mostly. 2/3 were women, 1/3 were men, and 400 to 500 were children, which is its own story. And the other statistics have to do with Auschwitz. The rescue in Bergen-Belsen took place from April 23rd to May 21st. Glyn Hughes, the Victory in Europe Day was May 8th. Glyn Hughes would not allow the British flag, the Union Jack, to be hoisted on Victory in Europe Day. He wouldn't do it until the last hut was evacuated. And then there was this ceremony where the last hut was burned down. And there is Glyn Hughes standing there. He gave the order for the burning down of the last hut. And survivors from the DP camp and soldiers, there was a big crowd who came to witness this really historic moment. This is the largest of the buildings in the Glyn Hughes Hospital, and the sign pointing there. And this little country near Sri Lanka, the Maldives, for the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, they issued these commemorative stamps. And it was such a moment in Bergen-Belsen that was one of the stamps commemorating the end of the war 50 years later. And the stamp was created from this picture, this image of the last burning hut. And there was an effigy of Hitler here and a flag with the Iron Cross. Inmates, British troops burned the last hut at Belsen. So I did a little statistical analysis, and my mom is from Sziget, this Carpathian mountain town in Transylvania. That was Hungary at the time of the war. And there were about 13,000 Jews deported from Sziget, and that includes about 1,500 from the surrounding villages, were taken to Auschwitz in mid-May 1944. Fast forward a year, and there was about 174 people from Sziget who were taken to Sweden. Now my mom had no thoughts of going home. She had no thoughts, period. She couldn't make any plans for herself. She survived, and her older sister Elizabeth survived, who's about a year older than her. And they were the only two people from their very large family who made it. And so the Swedish government, in a humanitarian gesture, took in about 7,000 survivors, aiming to rehabilitate them and get them well and put them on their feet. And they thought maybe they would stay 6 months and then move on to be repatriated to their home countries, but that's not what happened in hardly any cases. And in my mom's particular case, she wound up staying in Sweden for 10 years and in and out of TB sanatoriums. But I thought that these numbers of people from Sziget who arrived in Sweden tell some sort of story, a little bit of a microcosm of who actually survived the war in terms of age range. So you could see very few people in their 50s had a chance, even in their 40s. And of course, there are people from Sziget who survived maybe in different places, though 80 to 90% of the transports from Sziget were killed in Auschwitz. There were some people who were other places. There might have been a lot of Sziget survivors in Bergen-Belsen who didn't wind up going to Sweden. But it does show that most people who survived the war were in their 20s. And my mom was one of the youngest. She was born in 1929, so she was 15, and there were very few who were younger than her. And one of the first hospital my mom was taken to in Sweden was a makeshift hospital in a place called Katrineholm. And this is significant for me because this is the absolute first picture we have of her. It's a few months after the war, shortly after she's arrived in Sweden, after she had been in quarantine. And it's the first, we have no pictures of her from her childhood, no pictures of my grandparents, no pictures of anyone in her family. So this is the only picture I have of her as a kid. And you can see in this photograph that she has black and blue marks under her eyes and still not completely healed from being severely beaten up. And then I do have an opportunity in the epilogue to talk a little bit about Glyn Hughes. This is a picture of him in in Bergen-Belsen. You could sort of see the seriousness in his eyes, and he is. I thought he was a remarkable figure. He was sort of a little bit like Oscar Schindler, not exactly, but he really connected himself to Jews for the remainder of his life. He was very moved by what he saw at the camp and by his role. He really embraced his role in the history of the Jewish people, became a champion of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And I talk about that in the epilogue, along with alluding to some of his other activities. He was a great sportsman, golf, rugby, football, but I really focus on his connection to survivors and to the Jewish people. And my mom, this is a picture of her and Elizabeth, her sister, as young ladies in Sweden, which really was a wonderful country. It did put them back on their feet. My father is also a survivor. Here is a picture of him in the displaced persons camp, and this is their wedding photo. And this is a picture of my mom today, and she speaks to school groups all over the world, and she's gotten quite proficient at Zoom, so I'm very proud of her. And I'll just tell you one more little chapter. And this is a chapter that was part of the watershed that Glyn Hughes experienced in the months after the liberation, when he saw amazing things happen among the surviving community. So while mourning incalculable losses, survivors, nearly all of whom had lost most of their relatives, formed a vibrant displaced persons community. The devout and the secular, those who had lost faith and those who held fast to Jewish precepts, united around a common goal: to create a meaningful narrative of their sufferings by turning their sights to a Jewish homeland and to a future in which they could live normal lives. And this is a very big post-liberation chapter. So I'll just show you a couple of things: uniting around a common goal. Here's Yosel Rosensaft. You have to realize that some of the people who survived, if they came from camps and they arrived in Bergen-Belsen maybe just a week before the liberation, they were already in a little bit better shape. Some of them had been trained as Zionist youth leaders before the war. They were really good and talented organizers. And one of them was Yosel Rosensaft, who immediately assumed leadership of the DPs, and they started to advocate for the Jews to go to Palestine, which was a big political thing happening in Europe at the time. And I just have to say that Glyn Hughes was a Zionist. So he was really, that's one of the things that made him so stand out against the policies of British officialdom. He was a champion of the survivors and their cause. So the concentration camp set up a theater, was very cathartic because they put on plays staging some of the things they had experienced. ORT, the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training, came and we're setting up these workshops to train the survivors and give them some skills. There was ultimately about 12,000 survivors in the DP camp. Not, again, part of my mom's experience, but an important chapter. And there was about 420 men and 300 women who had been married and did not know the fates of their spouses, right? It was a very crazy time after the war. People were separated and they didn't know what happened to their husband or wife. And so the rabbis were very conscious of this, and they had a special Bergen-Belsen ketubah written up because most of them in their 20s, late 20s, early 30s, were looking to rebuild right away. And they maybe paired up quickly and wanted to remarry. But the ketubah had a caveat that if their former spouse appeared, there would have to be some responsibility for that marriage and that relationship in terms of material things. But here are just some images of what was going on in the post-war era. There were 2,000 babies born to in the Glyn Hughes Hospital in the years after the war. The DP camp was in operation for several years for lots of reasons, but you could see there was like a parade of strollers. Everybody was having babies, and there was a kindergarten, and it was quite something. And yeah. So I'm going to now play for you a brief video by Rabbi Tzvi Asaria Herman Halfgott, who was in Yugoslavian POW camps, but as soon as the war was over, came to assist in Bergen-Belsen.
ולקבור אותם. אבל
I'll start from the beginning. Oh, sorry.
ופתאום למחרת דופקים בדלת, אומרים לי, הרמן, אתה ישן? לא. אתה שמעת את החדשות? לא. מה יש בחדשות?
Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. That's not what I wanted to show you. Hold on. Just bear with me 1 minute. Okay.
ולקבור אותם. אבל מה? הייתה פקודה מאנגלים, שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות בגלל המחלות, אלא קבר אחים. קבר אחים. כולם יחד. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, ועל זה שוב כן איזה 30-20 וזה, כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שאלפים כן. אבל יום אחד ניגשה אליי אישה ואמרה לי, רבי, שמעתי היום שבבלוק הזה וזה, ביתי נפטרה. אז אמרתי, אז מה לעשות? אני רוצה קבר בשבילה, קבר יחיד. אמרתי, אבל זה בלתי אפשרי. אבל לכן אני מבקשת ממך. אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? בלילה כשחיילים בדרך כלל, האנגלים, נמצאים במועדונים, אז אנחנו נקבור אותם. אנחנו נביא את הגופה, ואנחנו כן נקבור אותם. ובאמת, בלילה היא קמה מהמיטה, ואני ניסיתי מהר לקבור אותה, קדיש להגיד, ופתאום כשאני רציתי כבר סתום את הגולם, היא אומרת לי, רגע אחד רבי. והיא פנתה עם העיניים לשמיים ואמרה, ריבונו של עולם, ביידיש, אני מודה לך לזכות הגדולה, שנתת לי היום לקבור את ביתי במו ידיים. אמן. מרגע זה, אני מוכרח להגיד, נעשיתי אדם אחר. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, כי בדרך לחיים. ופה התחלנו לאשכול לדאוג, היו כמה ילדים לגן ילדים, ואחר כך להקים בית ספר, כן. פה עזרו לנו הרבה אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלזן גם כן. והקמנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. חיים חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה אני עסקתי עד 48, כן. פה בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו' וכו' וכו'. ואני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל משפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם חופה וקידושים שאני אחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היה בילד האלף כשאני החזקתי לידיי. הילד האלף. אני עברתי
Whoops. So that is my presentation. This was a sign that was erected. It's not there now in Bergen-Belsen, but it was immediately or soon after the liberation, which the British were so fuming and just so angry and sarcastic. So this is the site of the infamous Belsen concentration camp, liberated by the British on 15th April 1945. 10,000 unburied dead were found here. Another 13,000 have since died, all of them victims of the German New Order in Europe and an example of Nazi culture. So if you're interested, this is my website. I have lots more pictures of my mom and the brigadier and other information. So yeah, I'm going to stop the share now and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Bernice. Really, I mean, startling, moving, shocking. It's impossible to bring together all the words. There were a couple of questions that came in over the course of your presentation. Both of them by people named Deborah. I'm not sure whether that's meaningful, but I like to introduce questions by saying Deborah asked. In this case, it's two different Deborahs. One asked whether the burning of huts, why wasn't it considered to be the destruction of evidence? And do you think, this is my addition, we might have a different response to these discoveries today? Might we want to preserve them for other purposes, for memorial, commemoration, and the like? It's very striking to see those photos of the burning. So maybe you could respond to that.
Yeah, that's really an important question. It was really because of the disease, because of the typhus germ. Everything was very contaminated, and it was, yeah, so they had to. There was not much choice. It was a very infested place and very filthy with every kind of human filth and disease and sickness. So that's why they had to burn the huts.
Okay. The other Deborah, who wrote this question during your presentation, was interested in perhaps you're saying more on the beating of your mother by fellow prisoners. It's a very disturbing story. Do you have an insight into it? Could you say more?
Yeah, there was a reason for it, but I really wanted to talk about it, and I wrote about it in the book because because people think, you think that once order is restored, once the liberators are there, there's no reason for things to happen, but a lot of things were still happening on the ground. And when my mom could not pull down the flap door of the tent, and she was basically expelled from the tent and she crawled back to the hut. She went there and she wanted to reclaim the spot she had previously. And the inmates who were in that spot, and everything meant something, right? So she had a spot against the wall and her back was aching because of the TB, and she wanted to rest her back against the wall. When she tried to reclaim her spot, everyone who was around that area, all the inmates, her compatriots, were just whatever ounce of strength they had in her, they just beat her up. They just were so incensed. And she would never blame them. She wouldn't think them at fault. She said we were all reduced to animals. It was just, that was the situation.
Okay.
But they could have killed her. They nearly killed her.
Really? Oh, terrible story. But yes, I mean, what brutality can do to human beings. Did your mother maintain relationships with anybody with whom she spent time at Bergen-Belsen?
I wouldn't say Bergen-Belsen, right? Bergen-Belsen was not a time to connect with, but I would say that she did maintain relationships. There was someone she worked with in one of the labor camps that she had maintained a friendship with. And when she got to Sweden, I talk about this a lot in the book. So here you have all these orphan teenagers. Where are they going to go? How are they going to go? And She was sick inside of TB sanatoriums for a long time, but she did have 7 months in this school that was set up for teenage survivors to give them some education. And they became like a family, and she kept in touch with people from that school. So she did.
Got it. Somebody's interested if you, you seem to, you hinted at the details, but what the condition was in the ketubah of those who married after the war, not knowing the fate of their spouses.
They had
Can
to
you say more
provide
about the conditions? Yeah.
There had to be some material provision. I don't know if it was like a percentage of their income or something, but they had to share something materially with the former spouse if that person happened to suddenly appear.
Mhm. And do you know, I mean, I know from my own work as a Talmudist and a teacher of Talmud and rabbinic law at JTS, the Talmud actually deals with the problem of a spouse who disappears and then and someone remarries and then the spouse shows up years later, because of course when someone traveled in the ancient world, you might lose contact and might imagine that they had been lost on the road or something. And there can be some onerous consequences to remarrying because technically speaking, you were still married to the first spouse. Do you know whether these ketubot dealt with that legal issue as well?
I don't know, but I'm imagining there must have been some rabbis who were like you, very knowledgeable about the Talmud and probably drew on those sources, but I don't know the details.
Okay, okay. There's a personal question, yeah, which you can answer or not answer. Judy wants to know how your parents met. And then John is interested in your saying something about what distinguished Bergen-Belsen from, and the atrocities that took place there, from other camps, and in particular from Auschwitz-Birkenau.
So I'll answer that second question first. So Auschwitz-Birkenau is a completely different story than Bergen-Belsen. It was just, if you read survivor accounts by people who were in both places, they would say something like Auschwitz was a clean or spick and span hell where people were um, either killed right away. You didn't see that many people emaciated and skeletal form. It was just the gas chambers were going day and night, and it was a different form of hell. You smelled the stench of the burning bodies. The sky was red. It was a horrific inferno. And Bergen-Belsen was completely different because people were not killed there. I mean, they weren't deliberately, they weren't like gas chambers. They didn't know what to do with the bodies, and it was completely like, one was like commission and one was omission. Omit, take away everything that a human being needs to survive, habitable place, a place, and just take away everything, food, water, everything, and don't kill them, don't provide for anything, and you just had this other kind of hell. Anybody who was in both places, I mean, it was horrible to say, but I mean, Auschwitz was, everybody who was there just, it said it was unimaginable, but everybody who was in both places would say that Bergen-Belsen was even worse.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. I want to share with you that as a youth, when I began to learn some of the details of the Holocaust and its horrors, the first voice that told its story to me was that of my physics teacher in a public high school in New Jersey, who was actually a survivor and had spent time over a year at Bergen-Belsen. Her father was a physician who was called upon by the Nazis to actually service their needs, which gave them certain privileges as prisoners within the camp. But she describes the fact that as the armies were approaching and it became clearer that the territories were going to be conquered, they were loaded onto trains for shipment to, to be executed, murdered at Auschwitz. and they survived only because they came to a river where the train bridge was bombed out, and they were forced to unload the train, and they were about to be forced into the river, effectively to be drowned, when the first American troops came through the forest and liberated the train. So that was the end of her Bergen-Belsen story. She does recall actually having been there at the same time as Anne Frank.
That's yeah, that there were some trains that were taken out of Bergen-Belsen
Right.
for various reasons, but Bergen-Belsen in 1942 was different than Bergen-Belsen in 1943, was different than Bergen-Belsen in the spring and the winter and spring of 1945. So
I also have to tell you that I mean, you mentioned in the book, you said your mother's from Siget, and you mentioned that Elie Wiesel was from Siget as well. My first teacher and my dissertation advisor at the Jewish Theological Seminary he's still alive, a professor named David Weiss Halivni. I see you're shaking your head, so you know him too. He was also from Siget, and I used to come to his office on Friday mornings for our meetings about my work on my dissertation, and he would be finishing up his study partnership time with Elie Wiesel. They would study Talmud together, and as I arrived, Elie Wiesel was leaving his office.
that's a special moment that you
Yeah,
had, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and going back to the question of how my parents met, so
yeah.
they met like 10 years after the war, which was also very unusual because, as you saw from what was happening in Bergen-Belsen, people tried to pair up very quickly. And my father was in that age group, like he was in his 20s, and he had opportunities to marry and pair up, but he didn't want to. He really consciously didn't want to. He wanted to be more settled, and he came to the United States, and it was a match, and he went to Sweden to meet her, and they married in Stockholm synagogue.
Wow. Wow. Well, actually, it's so extraordinary and exciting part of your story is that image, that picture you have of the strollers, right? And then the testimony of Rabbi Helfgott of people grabbing onto life and going on, having children, getting married, really so inspirational and beautiful.
They say it was the biggest baby boom in history. I don't know the exact numbers, but way more women were having babies in Bergen-Belsen than in the German surrounding area.
Wow. Wow. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. Well, I want to thank you for the presentation, for putting pictures to the narrative. But let me emphasize to everybody who's on that along with the pictures, some of which are in the book, not all of them, I think you included, right? The narrative is moving and engaging in the fullest sense. So I encourage all of you to pick up a copy of the book. As they say, the book is available wherever books are sold, but it's published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And you can, if you log on to press.jhu, that's Johns Hopkins University, so press.jhu.edu, you can order a copy, and if you put in the code HTWN, you can get a 30% discount. So thank you, Bernice, for sharing that information with all of us. I encourage everybody to pick up a copy because you'll find the time spent with it, a time very, very well spent. Let me end just by saying that, as I said at the beginning, this is the week of Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah is Thursday. On Thursday evening, we, the Library of JTS, are sponsoring a program, a very special program that features music composed by Cantor Gerald Cohen, who is a teacher in JTS's cantorial school, but amongst other things, a very distinguished composer. And the piece that he composed, which will be performed by a string quartet, is in commemoration of the musicians who wrote, composed, performed, and ultimately lost their lives in or in connection to Terezin. Gerald will introduce the piece, and the quartet will play the piece, very, very haunting, moving, beautiful music, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. You can come to the JTS website and register for that. And so I invite you, and I'm quite sure that you will enjoy the music and be very moved both by the composer's introduction and by the music itself. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I wish you all well and invite you back to future library events. And again, Bernice, thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.